Okay, so with watercolor, it's all about layering and knowing how to control the water and how to let the water kind of do its own thing and create its own cool effects. The thing that's beautiful about watercolor is that it is a little bit chaotic, and the water does its own thing, and when you can harness that and control that, that's the effect that you want to go for. So I'm using this little landscape as an example, and it has a lot of detail, but we're going to start with the first layer, which is going to be a wet on wet technique. So the first thing you want to do is just wet your paints. So I'm just adding a little bit of water to each of them, just to reactivate the paint. Okay, and I'm going to start with a little bit of blue and very diluted. So I need to add a lot of water, not much pigment. Okay, and then I'm going to paint, I'm going to leave a border, so I'm not painting all the way to the edge. And the first layer that you put down, the paper is quite absorbent, so it kind of dries really fast. You want to make sure you have a little bit of water sitting on the surface, but not so much that it's going outside of the edges, okay? I just want to make sure everything's still moving around well, and there's just water sitting on top of the surface, okay? Okay, next I'm going to mix up some red. And put down my trees. And I just add the general shape of the trees and a lot of dots. Okay, and this is what you want. You want this little starburst or tie-dye technique where it's spreading into the water. If it's not spreading, that means your paper is too dry. And if it's spreading too much, that means your paper is too wet. And it's a little bit of a learning curve, knowing what's the right amount of water. Okay, now I'm going to add some of the brown that was down by the chunks. Okay. And then there was a little bit of shadows at the base of the tree trunks and on the road. And then I want to put a little bit more of some vibrant blues up in my sky. Now my paper is curling, so that's causing things to just pool towards the edge. Okay. If you have a huge pool that you don't want, you can take a paper towel and just let the paper towel absorb. You don't really want to touch even the paper with the paper towel. You want to just touch the water, the pool, with the paper towel, if that makes sense. Okay, and that would be your first layer of your painting. At that point, you'd let it dry and leave it alone. Just let the water do its thing. Now, I wasn't doing any big sweeping brush strokes or really trying to control where things go. I just dropped the color down and let it spread, okay? And then I'm going to let that dry. It's smart to have multiple watercolor paintings going at the same time, so that you can let things dry and work on something else while you're letting it dry. Okay, but I have that, that's one I did before, and you can see I didn't pick up the pooling that happened on the side there, so it kind of made this like stripe there. Here's my reference photo that I'm going off of. Here's the underpainting. Okay, now at this point I want to add my more controlled layers, so I can use a smaller brush and more pigmented paint. So to get your pigmented paint, your paint really pigmented, you just want to swirl, swirl, swirl so that you get a nice pigmentation. Now, you don't want it so dry that it creates like, that's still wet. When you have a nice solid line and it still glides, that means it's wet enough. As your brush starts getting drier, look, I can't even, it will start leaving like texture behind, and for the most part you don't want that. Some people do that in a like a controlled way on purpose, but and now you can start doing your more controlled layers. With your more pigmented and less watery paint. Now I'm going to do some tree trunks. And this technique is called dry brushing. It's not really a dry brush, it's just a drier brush. When you just have more pigment, less water, and you're kind of drawing more detailed stuff or lines. Okay, and again, I'm going to let that layer dry because I want those to stay the way they are. I don't want them to spread into any of my other colors. So I can move to a different area. I'm going to put these shadows here in the, they're kind of in the base. Of the trees on the edge of the road. Okay, I was not liking what was happening in these dots right here, so I might try a little bit more watery diluted paint. I'm just being careful about where I put it down so it doesn't mess up my tree branches that are still wet. And it does reactivate with water, so I'm kind of just splotch those. With watercolor, there's a lot of just dabbing your brush rather than like directional brushwork. Okay, and while that red is still wet, I'm going to get some pretty pigmented yellow and drop that in. So this is kind of a controlled wet on wet. Instead of my whole paper being wet, now it's just a small area. I know that red paint is still wet, so if I work into it, I can add some yellow that'll just kind of blend itself in because the water's still there. Okay, let's blend this a little bit. These lines look a little too crisp. So I just have a clean brush with a little bit of water on it, so I can just soften that edge. Okay. Alright, what else is in this picture? I'm just looking at my reference, seeing what else I should add. My reference does have a little bit of red here. Again, I want to soften that edge, so I'm going to rinse out my brush so it's clean, tap off a little bit of the water, and add a little bit of water to soften the edge. If you want your paintbrush really dry, it's nice to have a paper towel on hand and just dab out the water with a paper towel. Okay, splattering. Let's talk about adding a little bit of splatter for my leaves. So I'm going to load up my brush with pigment, pull my bristles back. Now that's ruining my beautiful white border. If I wanted to keep my border white, I should have taped it off with masking tape first. And kind of just gently tap your brush against your finger to get some splatters. And then, I'm not sure how wet this is down here still, but let's try and do some of this. Oh, it's just bleeding right now. So it's just kind of wet right now, so I'll come back to that. This is wet too. I think I'm going to try and add some more shadows in the trees, because this line looks a little wanted to soften this edge a bit. This is called scrubbing, when you kind of swirl your brush on your paper to kind of erase. It doesn't always completely erase white, but that black shadow is just like too much of a hard edge, so I'm just trying to blend it into the trees more. Okay. Okay, maybe this part is dry enough that I can add some drops. And have them not spread into the water. Yeah, they're staying where they need to. Good. So watercolor is a matter of knowing how much water is on your paper and letting it spread and do its thing when you want to. But when you want a dry effect and you want your details to stay and your textures to stay, letting it dry completely before you come back to work on it.